The shared origin of collapse. What I want to speak to here is not accusation, not polarity, and not the tired division between survivor and narcissist. I want to talk about the structure underneath all of it. The structure both sides actually share, even though it expresses differently. Because what we call narcissistic abuse and what we call collapse in survivors are not two different worlds. They are two different outcomes of the same early absence. The absence of the early internal good object, the absence of dependable attunement, the absence of a maternal presence capable of teaching the lesson every human being needs in order to become whole, how to exist in the gaze of another. Without that lesson, the internal world does not form cohesively. And what we end up with as narcissists, as survivors, is not pathology in the moral sense, it is collapse in the structural sense. The narcissist's internal world was never cohesive to begin with. When people hear the term narcissist, they imagine one personality, one identity, one stable internal system dishing out bad behavior. But clinically and psychodynamically, this has never been true. What exists is a fractured field of self states, grandiose states, seductive states, omnipotent states, ashamed states, paranoid annihilatory states, infantile abandoned states, sexually charged states, withdrawing avoidant states, punitive critical introjects, idealized maternal introjects, rejecting maternal introjects. These are not integrated. They do not share memory. They do not share affect. They do not share a single coherent narrative. This is not a character flaw. This is the structural result of early relational absence. A child who never receives a stable gaze never consolidates a stable self. And so the adult lives inside a shifting internal world built around fragments, each one activated by different emotional demands. Survivors collapse too, not because they resemble the narcissist, but because the same early wound gets reactivated. This is something the recovery space has failed to articulate. Survivors do not collapse because they are weak or codependent. They collapse because the narcissist's internal instability destabilizes the survivor's internal cohesion. And if the survivor had any early gaps, any unmet need, any fragile imprint, any inconsistent maternal attunement, the shared fantasy reactivates it. When the idealization breaks, the survivor does not just lose the partner, they lose their internal good object, their stabilizing self concept, the mirror that held their identity, their sense of continuity, their feeling of being known, the early template of safety they were unconsciously replaying. This is why collapse in survivors is profound. It is not heartbreak, it is a neuropsychological shattering of the organizing self. Survivors fall into ASR3, the anticipatory shadow reflex, the pre-verbal somatic unconscious layer, and their internal parts activate. The redeemer, the mute child, the false protector, the introject enforcer, and the buried true self. This is a structural response to psychic overload. It is not pathology. It is not weakness. It is collapse under relational conditions no system can withstand. The narcissist does not regain wholeness because wholeness was never formed, but behavior can change. We must make this distinction precise. Survivors can rebuild cohesion because they once had it, even if only partially. Narcissists cannot rebuild internal cohesion because it never consolidated in the first place. But that does not mean narcissists cannot change. It means that the change must be externally scaffolded, therapeutically contained, supported by structure, guided by psychoeducation, reinforced through relational modeling. With the right framework, narcissistic behavior does change. Reactivity reduces, self state switching becomes visible, grandiosity becomes recognized, avoidance becomes manageable, coldness becomes interruptible, shame becomes differentiated. We do not yet have a cure for narcissistic personality disorder, but psychology has never cured anyone. It has organized people. It has given structure to places where structure was never formed. That is all any of us are doing. The fantasy script is the narcissist's internal stabilizing system, not a calculated cruelty. What survivors often experience as manipulation, coldness, or deception is, in structural terms, the internal fantasy script regulating the narcissist state of being. The fantasy script contains the false self, the idealized image of the partner, the fictional sense of mother, the coalesced introjects, the omnipotent narrator, the grandiose monologue, the internal dialogue between parts animated by the narcissist themselves. The actual partner, the real human being, does not enter this script directly. They are represented in it through what Vaknin calls coercive snapshotting, a process where the narcissist internalize an idealized image, a profile, not a person, and uses the real partner only to regulate the internal conversation between the false self, the idealized snapshot, and the fictional maternal echo that both of these serve. This is not about malice. This is about psychic survival. The narcissist is not relating to the external other, they are relating to the internal organization that prevents collapse. The shared root, the missing lesson that should have been given with love. And this is where the divide dissolves. Survivors and narcissists are not opposites, they are two expressions of the same early wound. The absence of a maternal gaze that teaches the mind how to become organized. Without that early attunement, the survivor grows up with gaps, the narcissist grows up with a void. The survivor loses the good object later in life, the narcissist never had one to lose. One collapses inward, the other collapses outward. But the origin is identical. Both are trying to carry a wound that should never have existed. Both are trying to hold a structure that was never taught to hold itself. Both are trying to live without the early lesson that every human mind depends on. You exist in my eyes, and because you exist in my eyes, you can exist in your own. That lesson, the lesson of being held, mirrored, and recognized, is the foundation of psychic cohesion. Where it is missing, both groups suffer. Survivors suffer in collapse, narcissists suffer in fragmentation. This is not about blame, this is about understanding. Why this conversation matters. The NPD community, the survivor community, we are all describing the same internal wound from different ends. MPIT exists to bridge this gap, not to erase harm, not to excuse behaviour, but to map the structure that gives rise to both sides of the relational catastrophe. If we can see the injury behind the behaviour, then we can talk to one another without shame, without accusation, without defensiveness, without myth making, and without fear. Both were wounded by the same early absence. Both were shaped by the same missing lesson. Both are victims of a collapse that began long before either relationship. And if we can finally talk about that, the conversation becomes human for the first time. Peace out. Loads of love.